Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. It's now my great honor and pleasure to moderate our next panel, and I briefly introduce our speaker. So my name is Nina Schneider, and I'm a research group leader at the Käte Hamburger Kolleg Center for Global Cooperation Research. And each speaker will be given 15 minutes, and we'll proceed in the range of order, save for Professor Arif, who will speak last. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker who will join us digitally. So Asra Mamnoon is a PhD scholar at Jamia Millia, Islamia in New Delhi. Her main area of research is the question of case studies in general and social stratification among India's Muslims in particular. And she specializes in the Pasmanda, she specializes in the identity of the Pasmanda Muslim in literature. Her other areas of interest include Indian writing in English and film studies. And one of her current interests includes Indian ocean studies, which have not been duly represented in literary studies, in her view. And in her view, which are still dominated by the Atlantic world. So Dr. Mamnoon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. Hello?
Yes, sorry.
Oh, it's all right. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for putting this event together. And although I couldn't be there in person, I'm very much there in spirit. And for some reason, I think it's the weather. My internet is really unstable today. So I just hope that my call doesn't get disconnected. So the paper that I'm going to present today is very much related to my work during my MPhil, and my dissertation dealt with the question of social stratification among India's Muslims. So this paper is a bit related to that. And the title of my paper is Like Banners on the Sea, Muslim Trade Networks and Islamization in India. Placed within the rubric of Indian Ocean Studies, this paper attempts to study the spread of Islam through maritime trade between India and the Middle East, and what it meant for the religion to intermingle with a culturally multifarious and elaborately stratified society like India. The spread of Islam to the Indian subcontinent is predominantly perceived in terms of Muslim invasions beginning around the 10th century. Islam, however, began spreading its roots to India much earlier, facilitated through its maritime trade with the Arabian Peninsula. The western coast of India was the first to come in contact with Islam when Arab traders as early as the 7th century came to coastal Malabar and Konkan, Gujarat through the Indian Ocean. Merchants would regularly sail to the west coast of India to trade goods such as spices, gold, and African goods. Naturally, when the Arabs began to convert to Islam, they carried their new religion to the shores of India. The first great expansion of Islam into India came during the Umayyad dynasty of the caliphs, which was based in Damascus. In 1711 AD, the Umayyads appointed a young 17-year-old Muhammad bin Qasim from Taif to extend Umayyad control into Sindh, which is a region in Pakistan, really. Now, also, as a result of the growing maritime exchange and the seasonal nature of monsoon navigation, South India became a new international commercial hub as the strategic intermediary between the Middle East and Southeast Asia. It is the continuation of this type of international exchange that Ibn Battuta later witnessed in the 14th century when he described Calicut as one of the greatest ports in the world visited by merchants from China, Java, etc. While historians have been reluctant to see merchant sojourners as sources of cultural transmission in the case of Islam, the initial propagation of the religion began through trade only, wherein it was not just spices and other goods which were being transported, but also missionaries. It must be remembered that Islam is an actively proselytizing religion closely tied to the concerns of trade. The Quran repeatedly refers to maritime trade and even describes the sails of ships as portents of the faith. Certain missionaries and also many Sufis played an important role in the spread of Islam in India. One of the most prominent figures was the 14th century Persian Sufi saint Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti, who later influenced Indian Sufis such as Nizamuddin Aulia, among others. Such figures initiated the practice of conversion to Islam. The first advent of Islam in South India dates as far back as the 8th century when a band of refugees to whom the Mapillars traced their descent came from Iraq and settled in the country. The trade in spices, etc., between India and Europe, which for many hundred years was conducted by the Arabs and Persians, caused a continual stream of Mohammedan influence to flow in upon the west coast of South India. The conventional account of the introduction of Islam into Malabar, as given by a Mohammedan historian of the 16th century, represents the first missionaries to have been a party of pilgrims on their way to visit the footprint of Adam in Ceylon. On their arrival in Kragnagore, the Raja sent for them and late leader of the party, Sheikh Sharaf Mehek, who was accompanied by his brother and nephew, and they took the opportunity of expounding to him the faith of Islam. Certain theories state that conversion happened forcefully. However, there were and still are vast numbers of converts or descendants of converts in whose conversion force played no part. While the Chishti order emphasized on love, tolerance, and openness, the missionaries propagated the teachings of the Quran and the Prophet. It has been argued that conversion among the local population began in the early 13th century and grew rapidly in the 14th century, primarily because during this period, Muslim traders gained a certain economic and political status to promote large scale conversion. It must be understood that Indian culture also had its effects on foreign Muslims. For instance, they produced new interpretations of Islamic law designed to meet the specific needs of their heterogeneous communities. Many prayed in buildings that looked like Hindu temples, and some worshipped saints outside of the Islamic tradition, while some even married non-Muslim women. Richard Eaton, professor of history at Arizona State University, in his book, The Rise of Islam and the Bengal Frontier, has laid down certain theories behind the conversion of non-Muslims in India to Islam, first of which is post-conversion or religion of the sword, as he calls it. As a theme in the Western historiography of Islam, writes Eaton, it has a long and weary history that dates from the time of the Crusades. And for Indian Islam too, it has always had its advocates. Yet those who argue that Indian Muslims were forcibly converted generally fail to define either force or conversion, leaving us to presume that a society can and will change its religious identity simply because it has a sword at its neck. Second is the political patronage theory, which meant that Indians of the medieval period converted in order to receive some non-religious favors from the ruling class, such as relief from taxes, promotion of the bureaucracy, etc. And the third is what he terms as religion of social liberation theory, the substance of which is that the Hindu caste system is a rigidly discriminatory form of social organization, and that the lowest and most degraded castes recognizing in Islam and recognized in Islam an ideology of social equality and converted to it en masse in order to escape Brahmanical oppression. Ronald Ritchie, in his book Islam Translated, also talks about the third aspect. Both, however, stop at this. The religion of social liberation theory becomes redundant when one takes the case of hierarchies already present among Muslims. Even during the Prophet's time, there were certain distinctive tribes or kabile, as they are known, like Quraysh, etc. When it comes to modern India, stratification becomes even more rigid owing to the colonial censuses which divided Indian Muslims into categories such as Ashraf, who trace their lineage to the Prophet, Ajlaf, indigenous converts, but excluding the untouchables, and Arzals, the untouchables who converted to Islam, also known as Pasmanda Muslims. The social stratification taken under study has been done in terms of lineage, which has an indelible impact over other aspects of their lives. The Muslim community, in a general sense, is perceived as largely egalitarian. However, immense cultural differences proliferate among them if one takes the case of India. Recent scholarship, particularly sociological research by eminent sociologists such as Imtiaz Ahmad, Zarina Bhatti, and Yoginder Sikand, suggests a pluralism among Muslims which is as rampant in any other society. The categorization that the census did excludes another class of people, the Hindu Dalits or untouchables who converted to Islam in order to emancipate themselves from oppression due to caste practices in their former religion. They are known as Pasmanda Muslims, a term which has become popular after the formation of the Pasmanda Muslim Mehez, an Indian Muslim organization dedicated to the emancipation of the Arzal community. It is notable that although they converted, perhaps being lured by the Islamic promise of equality and brotherhood, the Hindu Dalits could never really escape the heavy baggage of their humble birth and faced an equal, if not more, discrimination in their newfound community. The scholar Gauss Ansari termed this group as Arzal, which consists of unclean groups such as manual scavengers and tanners, and they are at the lowest rung of the social ladder. It can be said that the flexibility attributed to Islam is confined only to the mosque and religious pilgrimages where all pray as equals. Firdaus Azmat Siddiqui, in her book A Struggle for Identity, notes how no cleaning lady, I can say that because it has been translated as mehtar, could ever think of sitting with a Sayyid or person of a higher class, and also how there was a separate passage for the cleaning lady to enter the house in order to clean the washrooms. She was debarred from touching the taps or drinking water and would be poured water only from a distance. What is more problematic for the Pasmanda Muslims is that they have not been recognized as a scheduled category by the Indian constitution, unlike their Hindu counterparts. In eastern Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, for instance, Muslim manual scavengers work alongside people of people belonging to the lowest castes of Hindus in sanitation crews and brass bands, and are subjected to the same forms of everyday contempt on account of their lowly birth. Yet the Hindu counterparts are identified by the state as scheduled castes, while the Muslim ones, because they profess Islam, are excluded from this category and its concomitant safeguards and benefits. Although different from the Hindu untouchables, the Muslim Pasmanda are subjected to the same kind of exploitation and segregation. For instance, in Muslim caste in Uttar Pradesh, Gauss Ansari observes that a manual scavenger, either Muslim or non-Muslim, is not permitted to enter a mosque, no matter how clean he may be at that time. And in almost all the households of the upper classes, for instance, Muslim Rajputs, the clean occupational castes, such as of manual scavengers and others, are generally served food in their own containers and are given water to drink in such a way that the jar does not even touch their hands. Discrimination on the basis of caste is not just confined to endogamy, it manifests itself in other ways as well. Extensive sociological research in this area has not really been done, and observation also endorsed by the sociologist Imtiaz Ahmed, who has been a prominent researcher in this field. Ahmed observes that Muslim groups who are commonly designated by terms such as Biradri or Zat are corporate and local entities. Even Biradris like Sayyid, Sheikh, and Ansari, who reside in different parts of the country, restrict marrying within their particular territories, and often their names are affixed with their respective territories. This is how one hears of Sayyids of Satrik. These are all places in India, Sheikhs of Allahabad or Pathans of Malihabad. It is also generally believed that hierarchies like Zat or Biradri are based not just on birth, but on other factors as well, such as occupation or economic standing. But it can be argued that these demarcations are based on birth alone. There is really no recourse through which, say, a weaver can be a Sayyid except that of birth. Consequently, if someone from a lower status group becomes economically prosperous or marries into a higher or another Zat, his category does not change. Sayyid Ali, in his research on caste among Muslims of Hyderabad, also notes that on one hand, there are Qurayshis who want to preserve their blood purity through strict endogamy. There are others in Hyderabad for whom the importance of lineage-based status identities, such as caste, have greatly declined. This has been possible with the expansion of economic opportunities, education, and a modern outlook with time. However, social stratification is still a grim reality in small towns and villages, if not so much in cities. As far as education and employment are concerned, half of government jobs and education opportunities are reserved for certain castes and social groups. Among Hindus, this entails that Muslims from the backward classes don't have the slightest chance of finding a basic job. Um, The Muslim community may shy away from accepting the existence of stratification, but they cannot steer clear of its ramifications. Thus, the Pasmanda Muslims have such a peripheral existence that their presence and identity has almost been concealed. The purpose of this paper was to bring forth the beginnings of Islam in India and the intermingling of Muslims amidst the pluralistic Indian society and its ramifications. Furthermore, there remains scope for a substantial amount of sociological research which can open new avenues into the socio, political, and cultural lives of Indian Muslims. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mamnoon. Also for keeping in time. I was trying to figure out how to send you a silent message there. You have to wrap up, but you.
Yeah, I was not following the time. I hope I didn't exceed much.
No, you were perfect in time. So thank you ever so much. And also thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah.
We will now move on to the next speaker and then enter the Q&A at the end of the panel for all the speakers. So thank you very much. So now it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Wiebke Keim. She is on site here, sitting next to me. She is a sociologist whose research interests focus on the sociology of knowledge and of science, the history of sociology, and the epistemology of the social sciences. Dr. Keim has coordinated a project on qualitative social inequality at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. And the project focused on 4 countries: Chile, Costa Rica, Spain, and Switzerland. Dr. Keim has also worked at the research center SAGE, Société Acteurs Gouvernement en Europe, at the University of Strasbourg. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for chairing the panel, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizing team for getting us all together. It is a real pleasure to be here. So regarding the topic of this scholarly encounter, forms of inequality within the international politics of scientific production, the material steering medium of funding of money appears as a key issue. How do I move this? Yeah. I thought I had understood this quite early in my own research work. When I started my PhD at the beginning of the 2000s, I rather quickly came up with this analytical tool that helps us to distinguish centers and peripheries within global academia. So my research project, my PhD project, was on the global circulation, production and circulation of social science knowledge between places that do not occupy equal positions within global academia. And I found it helpful to think of it in terms of centers and peripheries of knowledge production. So the framework is not at all based on anything related to colonial, decolonial, post-colonial theory, but it's directly drawn from Cardoso and Faleto, dependency and development in Latin America. So dependency theory, following similar approaches as the ones Claudio has mentioned on the first day, that is to make analogies between political economy on a global scale and the economy of knowledge production. And when I took the slide out of my own computer archive, for the first time, I added a plural S, centers and peripheries, to account for what I believe is the current situation within the global research and higher education system. So centers and peripheries here are relational categories that can be used for the North Atlantic with relation to its southern peripheries, but it could also be used when we think of Professor Burnell's talk on the first day to speak about Cambridge and its relationship to the British Isles. So it's a relational tool. Yeah, so I thought it was useful to distinguish 3 dimensions of the center periphery issue within global academia. And the first dimension was infrastructure and material organization, internal organization of research systems, where we can distinguish between developed and underdeveloped science systems. And there, of course, the key issue is funding available for research and teaching. And I dealt with it rather quickly through a set of global indicators. So I'm very happy that we have had Mohammed Hassan this morning, who already brought all sorts of statistics. I just present one slide on the expenses of higher education. The share of global expenses for higher education, you see that some countries look quite big and other whole continents nearly disappear from the map. Yeah, I was going to speak with some detail about a project that I'm currently working on together with my friend and colleague Ari Sitas, emeritus from the University of Cape Town. The project is entitled After BRICS and New Silk Roads, Reconfiguring the Production and Circulation of Social Science Knowledge. But due to all sorts of reasons that you can imagine, the project has been delayed and is still in its very early steps. So I will use still rather anecdotal insights from that new project together with other examples that I have come across during my own research journey to unsettle some of my own certainties around the significance of funding for scientific development. And I will construct my argument contrasting 4 examples. The first example speaks about important achievements in South-South intellectual production and exchange that have not relied on any particular funding. And I came across this when I designed a first course on the history of the social sciences outside of Europe at the end of the 1990s, where I brought this idea of center periphery to the students, and then I gave them readings on important intellectual contributions from the global South to the development of the social sciences globally. And while doing this, I realized that many of the authors actually were not tied to any university. Instead, they were part of what Manjapra and Bose have called cosmopolitan thought zones of the anti-colonial movements in many parts of the world. So Manjapra says to frame the global circulation of ideas within the lone axis of center versus periphery is to view the world through the colonial state's eyes and through its archive. As theorists of interregional and transnational studies have pointed out, the practice of taking sideways glances towards lateral networks that transgress the colonial duality is the best way to disrupt the hemispheric myth that the globe was congenitally divided into an east and west, and that ideas were exchanged across that fault line alone. So many of those cosmopolitan anti-colonial intellectuals were trained in European universities, and most of them at the point of time of intellectual exchange were without a university position. They had no institutional backing and no funding at all. So this was true for some of the most significant intellectuals who have contributed to anti-colonial struggles in the third worldist debates, like Frantz Fanon or Suzanne Demey-Césaire, for example. So I still think that the center periphery idea is valid for the global science system, but we need to take into account that significant South-South exchange has happened outside of it. The second example I would like to mention is that depending on funding mechanisms, funding sometimes is a curse rather than remedy. And I'm referring here to works of the French Center for Development Research that has a strong focus on sciences outside of Europe, in particular science in Africa, with the works of Jacques Gaillard and Roland Vast. And they described in some of their works how after the political independencies, many African countries moved first towards a national mode of science. Jacques Gaillard writes, for instance, a new generation of researchers appeared and selected on merit, often from humble backgrounds. They owe their studies to the efforts for education made by the new governments. It sustained a new process of scientific production, a national mode of science. And the main characteristics of this national mode of science was that science is for the public good. The state assumes a major responsibility for financing research and development activities. The direction of that science is determined by the country's most pressing needs. Research scientists, and particularly the scientific elite, are mostly civil servants and have the right to pursue careers. They are imbued with national values as well as professional ones. And besides the peer community, the recipients of the products of research are principally the public authorities. The direct users of the product are hardly involved. What then happens, as they observe, is the gradual deinstitutionalization of science in Africa and the move towards a new mode of research work that is international and largely privatized. They write, research has not disappeared from the African scene, yet in many places its mode of production has changed. Much closer to development than to investigation, it is less geared towards education and does not much lend itself to publications. Its principles can therefore be summarized as follows. And here comes another list. The profession is practiced within a system depending on orders for research work and on temporary contracts, not in the context of a career. The activity is either exercised in a worldwide or local network, depending on the demand pattern. international and not national demand determines the programs and objectives. The search for benefits and profit rather than knowledge becomes the axiom for action. And the system is no longer regulated by peer assessment, but by the market. So social science themes, and we're still on the agenda, mainly those that refer to the great concerns that North has about the South, like population, immigration, poverty, and emerging diseases at the time already. So funding is still available, even quite a bit funding depending on the topics that you study, but it's funding of a peculiar kind that does not especially encourage South-South cooperation. And the problem with that market-driven research is not only that the agendas are set elsewhere, outside of the logics of local scientific research, but also that it does not contribute to the reproduction of scientific capacity because it does not lend itself to teaching. What we currently observe, I think, would also deserve more analysis. This literature is now almost outdated. We now observe, I think, almost a funding war across Africa, with colleagues of mine, environmental researchers in South Africa, telling me that they have important funding from the US for their project, and then the Chinese government suggests funding for another project, and the US funding agency says, if you accept this, we immediately pull out. So I think the reality is we'd need to update this. The third example I would like to mention is that one of an initiative that has received important funds, but has not contributed to particularly stimulating knowledge production. And I'm referring here to the Islamization of knowledge debate that Nuruddin referred to in his talk yesterday. So this Islamization of knowledge debate dates back to the Mecca conference that was organized in 1977 with more than 300 scholars from more than 40 countries. All ministers of the Saudi Arabian government were present. The ministers of education of the Arab countries were present. All ambassadors of the Muslim world in the kingdom, as well as dignitaries and princes from different parts of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which gives you an idea of the significance and probably also of the funding sources that were poured into those networks. The aim of the conference was to address the causes of the Muslim Ummah's current crisis that was analyzed as a crisis of education, namely the bifurcation between modern secular education as imposed through colonialism on the one hand, and the marginalized persistence of the traditional Islamic education system on the other hand. The conference recommendations of that Mecca conference of 1977 contain a series of suggestions in view of consolidating this educational project through the creation of Islamic universities in various countries, through the establishment of a library, the development of bibliographic indices of curricula, syllabi and textbooks, of a series of giant scientific journals and book series, of stipends and scholarships for students to travel, and for the organization of seminars and conferences. Much of this has been realized. We have Islamic universities based on this conference now in several countries. We have the International Institute of Islamic Thought with its headquarters in Washington and branches in a whole series of countries. The International Institute of Islamic Thought publishes 2 important academic journals and a book series. You see here, that is the first of the book series. So Islamization of knowledge, general principles and work plan is what is a very executive approach to this project. And when I was started to feel interested in this debate, I wanted to read some of the books and journals and realized I could not get hold of them through any of the conventional Amazon, whatever, channels for provision of books. So I checked out how I can get hold of the books and found there was a branch of the IIIT in Paris. So I traveled to Paris, it was the closest by to get hold of the books. I went to the resource center of the Paris branch of the International Institute of Islamic Thought and rang the bell, and the lady opened the door and was completely surprised to see me. And I said, well, I'm coming to get hold of your books. And she said, really, you want to read our books? And she brought me into the room, and there were shelves of books that were still packed in plastic. They were not even opened. So what does all this tell us? I got the books, I read a large part of them, and they were really, whatever runs under the label, the explicit label of Islamization of knowledge in the social sciences, I can tell you is really mediocre in content. So what does we learn from that example? And the last example is to return with you to the project that I talked about, the BRICS project. The idea we had with Ari, and Arisitas has been member of the BRICS Think Tank Council and has been heading it until 2018. Our idea was to explicate the impact of the emergence of BRICS, so the Association of the Emerging Economies of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and its academic networks in the last decade. And our hypothesis was that new sources, public funding now, is poured into academic and research networks in the BRICS domain. With the BRICS Think Tank Council, the Academic Forum, sorry, that's the last slide. The BRICS Academic Forum and cooperation enabled between all the countries' research foundations for joint research workshops and conferences. So the idea I had in mind was that this is a case of decentralization of the social sciences, which is a concept that my friend Leandro Rodriguez Medina is now trying to coin together with Sandra Harding in a book they're editing. So decentralizing as opposed to decentering, which was largely a theoretical project and proved to be rather frustrating for the countries in the South. It has, the idea of decentering has quite importantly transformed academic institutions in Europe and North America, but in the Global South has not had such an important impact and proved to be rather frustrating. They came up with that idea of decentralizing the social sciences through institutions and through alternative funding made available. Now, interestingly, we are still in the phase of interviewing people. We could not gather everybody as we had imagined in an international encounter like this one. So we're interviewing through Zoom interviews. It's quite straining to do that. But the insights that we have for now are not so clear. It's rather contradictory. People tell us some are very enthusiastic about those new opportunities and really convinced it will make a difference. Others are more prudent, and the criticism we try to get through this online interviewing, which is not an easy situation to get critical remarks out of people. What they seem to criticize is that BRICS is mainly a state-to-state alliance. And the importance of state agenda in getting academics together is not helpful for the social sciences. So that's sort of the account we're getting, that it's too government-led and it's not enough demand-driven thing from below, rising out of academia itself. So what conclusions can we take now out of those 4 examples? What are the lessons learned? The successful example of the cosmopolitan thought zones that I mentioned is one of sort of bottom-up intellectual exchange around a topic that intellectuals themselves found highly relevant. There was a pressure to theorize irrespective of lack of funding and institutions available. The example of the African academic systems and their dependency on external funding and that market-driven mode of research, as well as maybe to some extent the BRICS experience is one of examples where the agenda and priorities are set elsewhere outside of the national academic fields and outside of scientific logics, which has its own effects. In the case of the African science systems, as the works of the French Research Study Center develops it, this has clearly led to a heteronomy of the scientific field. In the case of BRICS, the outcomes are yet unclear, also because it's a rather recent initiative and science systems need time to adapt. And the last example, the Islamization of knowledge, shows that massive funding was available. Important institutions have been created. There was a will also to collaborate internationally, but the outcome remained rather mediocre. So funding alone does not make the whole story either. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Keim, for complexifying funding opportunities. Then our next speaker is Dr. Vinicius Kauê Ferreira. So welcome. He's a postdoc fellow at the UFRJ, and he holds a PhD in social anthropology from the IHES in Paris. He edits the journal Novos Debates of the Brazilian Anthropological Association, and his research interests include ethnographic perspectives on academic circulations, epistemology and the history of social sciences as well, intellectual history, and intellectual relations between South Asia and Europe. So thank you very much.
Well, actually, I think the bio is not up to date, so I'm an assistant professor now. But it's very recent. So
my apologies and congratulations.
Yes, yeah. First of all, thank you to the conveners and to the organizing team of the conference for making it work in such difficult and complicated times. What I present today is something that I've been working on in the last years. So I will present some findings of my research on academic circulation of Indian social scientists in Europe. I will read so that I can stick in the time. Social science research established that the precarization of academic life, and I say life, not only work, is becoming overwhelmingly widespread worldwide. In a study published in 2016, for example, Ava Hole and Ulrich Taschler show that temporary contracts are becoming the modus operandi of university employment in several countries, such as Canada, Finland, Japan, and the UK, just to call those with levels of precarization of work, which means short-term contracts that are above 30–40% of the academic employment. In India too, ad hoc teachers constitute a mass of precarious employees present in all universities in the country. According to the Delhi University Teachers Association in 2016, this category represented 50% of the 9,000 teachers at the University of Delhi, whose remuneration amounted to 57,000 rupees per month under 6-month contracts. As in many European countries, the process of precarization of the Indian university began in the 90s, at a time when the country's political economy, which until then had been framed by a model we call soft socialism, was moving towards this so-called economic liberalization. The precarization of academic work in Europe and in India is more organically linked than it seems. It's a question, the question here is the relationship between two major actors of a global academic and scientific market. I would even say that academic precarity in Europe is linked to the international circulation of researchers from the global south, including researchers of Indian origin. I argue that the so-called globalization of the social sciences recuperates a post-colonial imaginary. So my presentation is a little bit post-colonial, not that much. So I argue that this so-called globalization of the social sciences recuperates this a certain post-colonial imaginary in the implementation, in the construction of international scientific policies that precarize the formation of so-called cosmopolitan elites, albeit in distinct ways according to national contexts and the positions that certain subjects occupy in a complex global social space. When I started my ethnographic investigation of the circulation of South Asian scholars building an academic career in Europe, especially in Germany and the UK, I had in mind the idea of meeting established scholars who had managed to establish themselves abroad. However, in addition to them, of course, I ended up meeting a massive number of Indian scholars, not to mention from other origins, other nationalities, who were in a precarious situation and for whom these circulations became an imperative for building a career. While I heard the heads of departments of these so-called global institutions say that, I quote someone, a head of department, Indian researchers are very mobile and we value that enormously. A large number of my precarious interlocutors who were on temporary contracts in different countries agreed that mobility was becoming a form of precarity of academic life. One of them, a man in his 30s, working as a postdoctoral fellow in Berlin, said to me, mobility, mobility, mobility. It's mobility for precarity. We have to be this kind of detached labor force with no future, right? By pointing out the dark side of mobility In particular, the fact that it perfectly supports the principles of casualization. The discourse of some of my interlocutors leads us to a position that is complex, to say the least. On the one hand, very few of us would be opposed to mobility as a fundamental pillar of cosmopolitan intellectual training and a rich and innovative scientific exchange. On the other hand, a growing body of research shows that the most internationalized institutions are also the most precarious ones. For example, Vita Peacock has shown that the very prestigious Max Planck institutes operate essentially on the basis of hyper-qualified workforce of international scholars who will never be among the 10% of the institution's permanent researchers, and who occupy, in principle, the positions of directors. One of my interlocutors, a postdoctoral fellow in one of the MPIs, explained to me, I quote her, at a meeting with the team, the director told us clearly that it's better to look for a position elsewhere. We are not supposed to stay. For us, Germany is only a place of passage. From this perspective, mobility, it's not an opportunity, but rather a necessity. The vast majority of my interlocutors come from the historically privileged Indian middle classes and upper castes. Beyond the professional stability of the most common occupation in these families, doctors, professors, diplomats, civil servants, and business executives, being a middle class in India historically means belonging to well-connected families, family networks at all levels of the state and the private sphere, including within Indian and European scientific institutions. This is a generation of people born in the 90s who believed the promise of a stable future, like their parents. However, the same decade, the 90s, was marked by a so-called economic liberalization, when India underwent a series of transformations that were both unexpected and disappointing for this generation. While European universities were opening up to recruitment of non-European scholars, which was completely new, and Indian universities were integrating into this global academic market, new liberal policies were being felt through the casualization, the precarization of academic work on both countries. Here is how a post-colonial history is, with a long intellectual history, right, of institutions, is updated in its new liberal version. While the circulation of students between India and Europe, and especially England, but not only, dates back at least to the beginning of the 20th century, with the foundation of the School of Oriental Studies in 1916, the opening up to the recruitment of researchers from former colonies became a new fact. Since until the beginning of the 2000s, European institutions had a very clear scientific policy: welcome students, send researchers back. Thus, the generation of Indian researchers who left for Europe for their doctoral studies from the 2000s onwards was confronted with a double transformation. While a career in Europe was gradually becoming a feasible project for scholars from the global south, permanent positions were becoming more and more competitive for all. Faced with this situation, young scholars who wanted to stay in Europe had to accept temporary positions, which implied, among other things, a kind of downwards mobility, social mobility, like a fragile legal status with the migration services, for example. Of course, returning to India is always an option. Nevertheless, it's here that the role of what some scholars have called the post-colonial predicament becomes important. Namely, the fact that the colonization has forged institutions, desires, forms of knowledge, and subjectivities that are deeply linked to certain Eurocentric imaginaries that are extremely difficult to get rid of when it comes to intellectual life. The majority of my interlocutors came from Anglophile families trained in academic institutions conceived from European models, for whom going to Europe or to the United States was a natural step in their training. Moreover, the desire to build a career in Europe, sorry, I will pass this, otherwise I will move over time. So this double prism, post-colonial and transnational, helps us to understand a process by which European universities are opening up to the recruitment of these scholars from the global south, and consequently, the specificity of the precarity associated with it, precarity that concerns everyone, of course, foreigners and locals, right? But this does not concern everyone in the exact same way. This is what I'm saying. There are specificities to it. The rise of cultural policies at the university has made diversity an asset, even a real added value, on which universities capitalize when they are overwhelmed by managerial practices. This relates, for example, to their strategies for attracting foreign students who pay very high fees, such as students from the Indian diaspora in England, for example, who want to have classes with Indian teachers. But also to the idea of cultural cosmopolitanism, that it's increasingly associated with the idea of excellence in the so-called global institutions. An important dimension of the global economy of knowledge, even if it's much less discussed, is the fact that with these scholars from the periphery circulates a set of symbolic and financial capital in which European universities are also interested. Concretely, several research centers on India, for example, research centers on India, not in India, on India, have been founded in the last 15 years in Europe, many of them financed or co-financed by the Indian government and companies. The centers devoted to Indian studies, where a large number of precarious researchers circulate, are certainly places for meetings and exchange, but also for the updating of geopolitical issues of great importance between these countries. To give an example, during my fieldwork in the UK in 2015, I could follow the protests, the demonstrations against the official visit of Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, from an extreme right-wing party. One of the fronts of these mobilizations were organized by a section of Indian and Indianese students and scholars based in Cambridge, who were opposed to the official invitation that the university extended to Modi. The university eventually canceled this invitation and did not host the Prime Minister. Cambridge's interest in this alliance was the same shown by other British universities. The aim is to foster science diplomacy based on attracting Indian students and public and private investments. This observation is based on documents published, for example, by the Consulate General of India, which contain all the figures concerning Indo-British partnerships with Cambridge, Oxford, King's College, etc. Thus, we can see that well beyond the sphere of the symbolic and the subjective, the post-colonial condition specific to the contemporary world shapes, above all, the economic conditions and the power relationships that define the principles and conditions of the production and circulation of scholars, of their academic recognition, as well as the concrete possibilities of research funding in Europe as much as elsewhere. What is at stake here is hegemony in a space of competitive struggles over the training of students, who constitute the elites that will bridge the North and the global South. In this case, the UK and India. Nevertheless, this opportunity may come at the bitter cost of precarity for these young scholars, a kind of post-colonial precarity, we could say. The tour through, and I'm concluding, the tour through contemporary scientific policies in their relations with cultural and economic policies helps us to better understand the links which may seem distant between the precarity of European researchers and that of Indian ones. Both European and Indian institutions are well aware of one thing. In Europe, Indian elites are being trained, as well as others, of course, not on we could talk about Latin American or also Asian in general. And the issue at stake is what kind of training these young people will receive, for example. In a post-colonial academia, that is also a new liberal one, and if we are talking about inequalities in science, we have to talk about capitalism, right? An emerging power like India, with a diaspora of 80 million people spread across all continents, seeks to assert its values in its project to become a global power. This imply an aggressive strategy of shaping the training institutions of their elites. For its part, Europe is also seeking to maintain its hegemony in the field of higher education market, while adapting to these new geopolitical developments in which the university plays a strategic role. Indeed, the process of precarization can only be understood locally through the prism of global dynamics of training, both the masses and the elites, according to certain worldviews that refound the university of the 21st century. The latter is becoming a space for training managers of the future, of resources that are certainly economic, but above all symbolic, which are increasingly valued on the global market, such as diversity, culture, knowledge, rights, and the very idea of future. Moreover, in the best of the cases, that is to say, when they teach a subject close to their research topic, these professors, these young scholars make use of symbolic capital, particularly academic and linguistic capital, accumulated during training between their countries of origin and Europe. So I'm not going further. This is it. Just I wanted to establish these connections between along colonial, post-colonial history and contemporary dynamics. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Professor Ferreira. We will now move online again, and I want to have the pleasure to welcome Hebe Vessuri. She is a professor emeritus and holds a PhD in social anthropology. Professor Vessuri taught social studies of science at numerous universities. So these include Dalhousie, Victoria, and Simon Fraser University in Canada, the National University of Tucumán in Argentina, the Central University of Venezuela, where she was based most of her career. She also taught at the University of Campinas in Brazil and at the UNAM in Mexico. It's our great pleasure to have you with us today. And I pass on the word to you, Professor Hebe Vessuri.
Okay, good morning. Good morning for me. Good afternoon for all of you. It's a real great pleasure to be participating with you, accepting your invitation. I'm so sorry I couldn't participate in the previous sessions, which from comments like those from Wiebke, which I say hello, Wiebke, and other people, has been very interesting. But life goes on in the rest of the world, and even if one has the willingness, it becomes impossible sometimes to attend, and Zoom conferences become very exhausting too. So, well, here is my brief comments to your very rich conference, with such a variety of cultural origins of cultural and national origins of participants. Well, I would like to comment on this, that heated debates grow in the search of policies and knowledge for a recomposition of in my case, the science, technology, and society field as both a mosaic and a transnational space of conviviality. So we have renewal of research agendas, methodological approaches and conceptual frameworks, as well as of the modes of commitment to society and to collective action, particularly aiming at protecting the common goods that have been so much threatened, appears as an unavoidable challenge. Since the topic has been touched already in today's session, and I suppose in previous one, I would like to go back to the time when the issue were centers and peripheries. When many years ago, I began to study science in Venezuela as a social cultural phenomenon. For me, it was not just a question of the institutional and organizational conditions that enable development as a scientific activity, the formation of a new social space, which was scientific space or scientific research. It was also the influence that those conditions could exert on the orientations of research, scientific practices, contents, ruled by something was the scientific ethos, it was called at the time, and principles of professional self-organization. The national space, which was a scientific national space, although perceived as peripheral, was also an area of social modernization for all of us. At that time, I, like other people, wrote of centers and peripheries in the structuring of scientific knowledge as a way of recognizing international asymmetries and inequalities. Okay. When talking of internationalization, we were far from imagining today's globalization, but all the ingredients, or almost all of them, were there. Besides, the sociologist of science in Latin America, as in the other continental regions in Asia and in Africa and so on, showed that scientific communities always fed on foreign contributions and that the circulation of knowledge is basic to science. But there were limits to our understanding, of course. Nevertheless, I want to make it clear once more, because this is a notion that has been, and it continues to be very much misunderstood. Peripheral science is not second-class science, but a science under a double tension. On the one hand, usefulness and development. On the other hand, the search of visibility, prestige, and recognition in the international setting. This dilemma, that is this essential dilemma, or this essential tension à la Kuhn, expresses an opposition less between tradition and modernity than between relevance and prestige. Although since the 1980s, there was a fundamental change from a national development model to a global one, whose social components are different and affect deeply both hegemonic and non-hegemonic countries, we in Latin America were deeply involved in trying to solve the earlier quandaries. And so while we understood that science, both in the application of its results as in its practice, is necessarily political, we did not quite capture that in the meantime, the crucial political spaces of negotiations had themselves changed. When then from those early challenges, the early studies of science and technology in Latin America managed to show some phenomena and processes that were constitutive of the science and technology dynamics. They created relevant concepts and contributed original knowledge that helped to change the understanding, the social understanding of science and technology. There were challenges to science and technology studies in and from Latin America, that have continued to be relevant because while science and technology changed, asymmetric relations also renewed themselves and persisted, were there, transformed, but there. But my question is, what happened to the cognitive authority, to the canon in the meantime? Today, emphasis is placed on the circulation of beings, objects, and ideas in a world with barriers that are crossed over in cities, in urban and suburban life. From many places comes the argument that the idea of hegemonic science has exaggerated both similarities and differences, unduly simplifying reality, neglecting variety at the micro level, ignoring re-articulations with norms, strategies, and all the particularities always present in world societies. In relation to this supposed idea of a universal science that was identified as hegemonic science, it is questioned whether the disciplinary canon became a straitjacket hindering the growth of knowledge, or whether it is capable to reconfigure itself once and again without eliminating the history of the processes and the variability of local specificities. And here I very much sympathize with many of the things that Vinicius has just told us. When Southern scientists leave their country in conditions of inferiority to try to enter the international labor market or to do a postgraduate degree that will give them a national and international credentials into the profession, they often must negotiate all kinds of cultural practices to survive, trying to fulfill their ambitions to continue or to rebuild, according to the moment in life in which they are in, to rebuild their lives and professional careers. These negotiations usually take place in the uneven, asymmetric conditions in which they must survive. You learn to live and coexist in difference, looking for a shared ground of practices and concerns that may allow fertile interaction. Precisely the notion of coexistence refers to a sophisticated ability to invoke difference while avoiding group or community precepts when referring to larger social groups. There are aspects of coexistence that survive or may resurface, showing a new value in the ability to live with or in otherness in science. It stimulates a disposition of the incomplete and the humility of doubt, and finds strength in issues related to interconnections, interdependencies, the compound, the incomplete. It is an invitation to see the production of advanced knowledge as a journey in collaboration and co-production, which teaches us the importance of recognizing debt and getting into debt with respect to how and to what extent we seek agency and autonomy. Coexistence describes neither the absence of racism nor the triumph of tolerance. Instead, it suggests a different setting for interpersonal rituals in the scientific milieu. These begin to mean other things beyond any strong belief in absolute or comprehensive theoretical, class, ethnic, or racial differences, as we move from national to transnational and transregional context. Unlike the false universalism that erases true deep differences, a prudent dialogue that negotiates minimal and progressive agreements can allow the advancement of the social sciences in a spirit of symmetry and openness. If coexistence helps to fix the local pole in this interpretive exercise, the other extreme may focus on the idea of transnationality, that I really prefer to the more familiar notion of globalization because it resonates quite differently. The transnational suggests both contingency and movement, first of all. But it also specifies a scale that is smaller than the global, which conveys all the triumphalism and complacency of the ever-expanding universals. However, the two terms, I think, are important to the overall tone and direction of the argument because they help precipitate a different sense of being a scientist and doing science. The dimension of coexistence, with a focus on how relevant issues are disputed in different societies, such as symbolic belonging, which is so important to all of us, political participation, the distribution of resources and risks, the rights of national and transnationals, is also of interest in relation to knowledge topics. When we integrate the study of interactions in scientific contexts characterized by inequality and diversity to the analysis of macrostructures, it is an openness moment with methods and directions that are sometimes diffuse, still exploratory, and experimental. When scientists from the South go abroad alone, in exile or in equivalent conditions, their scientific practices in many cases change. Although in their countries or in their institutions, they could have been oriented to the thematic specificities of the reality or group of personal or ideological affiliation, eventually marking a difference with the canon. In their new circumstances, they more often begin by repeating conventional canonical scientific practices of the type that we find in that image of a unique world in which they find themselves. The unique world, in inverted commas, of course. However, in doing so, their practices, even trying to work in that unique world, are unfailingly hybridized, helping to generate new worlds. So willingly or unwillingly, anyway, we are transforming the world all the time. Hence the idea that the canon, this is what I really believe, that the canon can be a temporary or a permanent lifeguard. You use it or not, usually it's a transitory lifeguard that you use for a period. Are there benefits of the crisis? Well, I don't know. In the outbreak of the contemporary world, we recognize the existence of a multiplicity of practices, each of which being a witness in its own way of the dimensions of its existence. There is no general frame of reference available for containing such multiplicity, which is why there remains so much room for experimentation with situated concepts, practices, and interventions. I propose that communication across cultural worlds is always possible, including the inevitable betrayals resulting from intercultural translation, which are constitutive of network relationships, something that we can never fully control or often barely influence. At the same time, prejudices and discrimination reemerge. This is a fact. They reemerge with great force, heralding a new period of intolerance. Evidences that we are still amid an important transition. But to have a sustainable science, inclusion and diversity are paramount. Recognition of many types of excellence, of quality, and of different facets of diversity are crucial for science. Sustainable research is already being done in different places, but there is a strong need to advance with geographies of knowledge and action for making the world of science more equitable and enabling us to achieve a global collaboration to address the big issues ahead. Well, thank you very much. for putting up with me.
Thank you very much, Professor Vessuri. We now have Yasmin Arif coming next. So it's my pleasure to introduce her. She is a professor of sociology at the SNU. She has taught sociology also at the University of Delhi for many years. And she has held positions at the University of Minnesota, the Graduate Institute in Geneva, the CSDS in Delhi, and also at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. She received various grants, including grants by the Mellon, the Ford, and the Fulbright Foundation. And she has been serving on the editorial board of the journal Indian Sociology for many years and is now currently a member of the editorial board of the American Anthropologist. So thanks in advance for your presentation, Professor Arif.
Thank you. I hope I'm visible and audible.
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Well, of course, I am the last one, I think, of the day, so I'm going to try to be as short, I'm sure, as short as possible. I'm sure everyone's tired. But really have to thank everyone for this opportunity. And like some others, I'm sorry not to have been able to be present in some of these very important discussions. But again, thank you for the opportunity. And it was a pleasure listening to everyone. And I'm especially happy that some of these concerns have now become part of formal discussion agendas, which is a very welcome change, I think, and thanks to all the organizers for that. I'm going to make very few brief points, and they are from a social anthropological and sociological perspective. However, I do hope I address a larger human science universe. To begin with, the first point I'd like to underline today is an unpacking of the notion of decolonization, which is now a very important part of the academic environment that we inhabited. And of course, is also the name, which is a little silent in the conference here, but I'm sure very much a part of our discussions. I will suggest that the geographical imagination embedded in it is not a singular universal one. For instance, the notion of India, and from where I speak, and her place in social cultural anthropology or sociology starts as an object of empire, British imperial rule to be precise, and moves on in the 1950s after Indian independence to nation building of sorts. I'll not have the time, of course, to add factual detail, but I'll flag one concern here, that the nation building exercise at the time of a newly formed nation and the issues that were at the heart of studying the social at the time, for example, approaching village India as a microcosm of real India, that was what was at that point the priority, have transformed into a whole new kind of nation building exercise in our current times. The contemporary vision of nation building and the knowledge production practices that are generated in that environment can have a twisted implication with the decolonizing exercise that is popular in our times. The movement from colonized knowledge to self-asserted knowledge can also be a dangerous path to other hegemonies and other oppressions. Keeping with the point of empire and nation double articulation in Indian sociological and anthropological discourse of the past 75 years, it is obvious that the engagement has been with British Empire and colonial rule. That's very well documented. Everybody knows this. And there has been a notable body, of course, of human science written in the post-colonial paradigm, as with many locations in the global south. However, I would like to differentiate between decolonization as an imagination linked to the global north, or if you like, Western capitalist stance, largely associated with the United States, and is different from the post-colonial perspective articulated in India or the global south. This is one line of argument that I'd like to pursue. For example, the North American decolonizing intentions in the political economy of anthropological knowledge production will be about the redemptive narratives. For example, this is very, very, just notional symbolic ideas that I'm talking about, required in the context of slavery and settler colonialism, or with the kind of relationship North American human sciences have with Latinx universes. The post-colonial narrative, however, does not necessarily deal with the same substance of inequity nor the same histories. While they share same concerns, the substance of their work is different. To put it succinctly, the Oxbridge cultures, and I think Vinicius's presentation tells you a lot about how India and the Oxbridge cultures and SOAS interacted. So that's a good bit of my work done, which is that, to put it, as I said, succinctly, the Oxbridge cultures and attitudes towards knowledges in the former colonies is a different relationship from the Black Lives Matter kind of consideration in American academia. So how do these two attitudes converge on an Indian anthropologist or sociologist, so to speak, who finds herself in this decolonial or post-colonial critique that is global on one hand and on the other national, local, and cultural? That becomes something to explore when the focus is on North-South relations. So let me try and explain this a little bit further. This is where we'll need to make a classification between scholars of India who are located and trained outside India, which is a vast community, again, something that Vinicius talked about, and also before me, Professor Vessuri talked about wonderfully. This is a vast community, and they have been trained outside, but there are others who are located within, trained within, like myself. Those of us in India and other locations like ours carry signifiers of three geopolitical maps: the global south, the empire, and the nation, but in very different ways, and these are heavy maps to carry. What knowledge can be intended, produced, and circulated will be a function of local intellectuals at climates and contexts. Their idioms of expression will be about the audiences they address and the locations of these audiences. So this brings me to a knotted problem of location, identity, and representation in the knowledge production exercise. To put it bluntly, and again, this is a personal position that I have, first, can I be anything different from a native or global South representative in the world stage? Second, what is my voice within India in my current national audience? This is a problem I pose in my writing and also in relation to questions on theory and knowledge production that can have global relevance. What kind of knowledges am I allowed to dabble in, and what is expected of my voice? While the contestations against hegemonic, the usual Eurocentric and Anglo-Saxon theory is an old one, the problem I raise is how must one mobilize that contestation in our contemporary times of planetary conditions like pandemics, climate change, environmental degradation, urban poverty, or gendered violence. So let me suggest a local example from the Indian context, the Dalit issue, or what is now achieving renewed visibility in the West as caste matters. Do these concerns have universal significance? Probably. But should this kind of work be about a decolonizing subject, or is it a globally relevant concern about humiliation and subjugation? Let me connect this to my earlier point about how decolonizing in the current Indian context can overlap virulent, damaging nationalisms, which are reflected in the kinds of research agendas which are supported and others which are silenced. And certainly these attitudes are not particularly supportive of a Dalit voice or another subjugated voice like a Muslim voice in the imagined nationalism that is currently on the ascendance. What might that Indian Muslim or Dalit voice speak as, and to which audience? Is there any value to that suffering in an universal idiom? My point is that when being the decolonizing or post-colonial voice, we need to be careful about the stabilizing and making permanent subjugated positions in the global South. someone who is culturally pure and bound forever in her historical condition. Rather, is it possible to see beyond geographies carved in stone to fluid possibilities of the human condition that need global support and humane intent? This is where I would urge the possibility of anthropology taking on the challenge of global relevance rather than emphasizing authenticities and particularities through a narrow decolonizing or post-colonial perspective. My emphasis would be on anthropology without borders, so to speak, where we try and work carefully with what decolonization can mean, what post-colonialism can mean, especially in a mature post-colony with very damaging national attitudes, insularities, and hegemonies, which can be perpetrated in the name of cultural identity, diversity, and representation. Decolonization and post-colonial critique must not be dictated and orchestrated, nor must they be echoes of metropolitan centers. So I'd like to propose that anthropologists be offered a choice out of identity, locational constraints, and geographical purity. I would ask for an equal participation, field of participation. In effect, I would propose an anthropological community where everyone, regardless of where they belong or come from, have equal opportunity in exploring their choice of research and representation. Epistemic diversity and difference are important, but epistemic insularity is not. Difference is important, but institutionalized managerial diversity is not. And this is a problem we need to tackle within national/regional anthropology cultures. Some anthropological universals like poverty, violence, humiliation, vulnerability, as well as environmental and biomedical conditions like I just mentioned, needs reinvigorating in terms of the contemporary planet. And this could involve local solutions, but also global concept. This brings me to my last point of how this can be supported in pragmatic terms. This is about funding practices. Again, something that I listened very closely to Dr. Keim, and I think these are very important ideas and inputs into what I think I'm also trying to say. And this is, of course, a forum that I'd like to talk about this, which is that, as we know, funding practices have a lot to do with how research and knowledge production takes place. To adjust the current political economy of knowledge production, we need to have dedicated funding for research students to pursue anthropological work from local, so-called global South institutions to worldwide locations who can have the same privileges and access opportunities as their counterparts in Northern universities, which is meaning to say that people from the North are rarely questioned when they are everywhere in the world with their research agendas. But as academics or researchers in the global South, our access to areas of research in the global North, topics which are absolutely about the global North, are completely restricted. Similarly, there must be funding to support social science and humanities research in the global South in subject areas that are not necessarily about the global South alone. This is something that I've just said. I have written for long on the profound epistemological impact this can have on encouraging some equity and balance in the many divides that are called into being in the name of diversity in formal academia. So I don't have the facts to show you right now. I'm still doing this research, but I've looked a little bit into international funding bodies and the list of grantees. And sadly, there are not many non-metropolitan students or researchers in the mix unless they belong to specified categories. Quality and competitive applications are, of course, always a problem in open competitions. And in that direction, funding to support grant writing and even academic writing, to just mention a few, will be very, very useful. These sorts of practices might make a new generation of global South students, allegedly, and academics globally competitive, not just in terms of the kind of precarious mobility that Vinicius is talking about, in real terms, in terms of work cultures and knowledge bases within nations and regions as well. In addition, the other problem, and this is also in the light of how national funding works, and in the case of India, there's practically nothing unless we're looking at the kinds, again, that Vinicius has already done the work for me, which is that the kind that you have agendas very deeply inscribed into them. So buffering local research endeavors in the South with global funding and international funding banners also provides a kind of legitimation. And we have to be very, very careful here to research that is sometimes lacking in the hierarchies that are inevitable in the North-South divides. There are, of course, many collaborative funding avenues, joint projects, outreach programs that lots of global North universities have with the global South universities, but we'll have to be very, very careful in recognizing what is extractive in those relationships, how much of the global South remain as research sites, as local informants, as local knowledges, and what power dynamics then of knowledge production are in place and so forth. So just to conclude this very brief set of points, I'm asking for a closer look at how much funding practices can be involved in addressing the concerns we call decolonizing and post-colonial. Overall, contemporary knowledge politics, whether it is in the hard sciences or in the soft sciences, need to tackle issues and concerns which keep the globe in view while standing in one's own locational shoes. What I'd also ask for is and we are moving towards that trend, is that not to stabilize identities and not to make them permanent, as I've said, in the knowledge production map. There is a need for some kinds of becoming rather than of constant being. So what is absolutely crucial, I think, in bringing in newer attitudes and discussions is the force of resource circulation and funding allocation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Arif. We now open the floor for questions and move straight to the debate. So I assume we start with the room. Yes, Professor Costa.
Yeah, thank you so much for this really illuminating panel. I have a question, I guess, which concerns different presentations, but it's more specific, addressed by Vinicius. And you mentioned this in your presentation, Vinicius, but the sort of precariousness or precarity, which is also true for locals. But listen to your presentation, you can have the impression this is specifically something that actually affects migrants or people with a migrant background. And I was thinking about the political consequences of what we have observed in your ethnographical work is actually what could be the answer to the problems you see there. You can either promote less precarity in the domestic labor market, academic labor market in these countries, which is not really likely to happen, just the opposite, or you can close the borders in order to avoid post-colonial precarity, what is, of course, not what you want. So my point is, what you are telling us tells much more about the precarity in the domestic academic work, at least in case of Germany, is quite present, and not really, and less about really this transnational circulation of people and also of scientists, scholars, and also of knowledge. So therefore, the question will be, what could be the political consequences of your observations? And then the second point, and now those who do area studies are somehow concerned by some criticism, because of course you mentioned in your presentation the Centers for Indian Studies, And also Yasmin also addressed also some questions related to that could be also addressed by area studies. And I think not for defending ourselves who also are doing area studies in the global north, but I think the role of area studies could be also seen from an internal perspective. So area studies as part of a competitive funding market in the global north, and ways for trying to find ways for cooperating with global south, if possible, symmetrically, even if the availability of funding is quite different in both regions. But you can, and this would be actually what I'll address in my question, especially perhaps to you, Yasmin, but also Vessuri, Hebe, because I think the format of cooperation is something that perhaps could be addressed. So I think that you can construct not only centers in the global north, but also centers in the global south, financed by institutions in the global north, and you can also create research networks. So my point would be that actually the format of cooperation is also relevant.
Yes.
Yeah, my question, hello, I am Eloisa Martin. My question is very much in line with what Sergio has said, and has to do with perhaps two levels on understanding North-South cooperation, and particularly regarding funding. From one point of view, we can understand that every, let's so-called international funding for global South cooperation is always nation-based. So, and what a nation or what a country decides to be prioritaire and in which sense and how this money is going to be spent is crucial. And we have perhaps little voice at this level. And my question or my comment or my request to the panel to react, because you are all not just researching, but also very active in this arena, is your experience, but also your suggestions regarding what happened, not at the institutional level, but at the person-to-person level. So at the level on how these funds that have been allocated are indeed used, and the relations of power within the use of these funds. As we have mentioned, for example, the local global southern or minorities are used as sources. I have received uncountable emails of PhD students for very fancy universities asking me to organize them their fieldwork because they have really little time to lose. So I can be the secretary of these PhD students. Of course, why not? You know, why not? But also, of course, and this is not minor, plagiarism and the steal of ideas of the global north, of the global south scholars that are used without any concern, let's say, by the global north. Why that? Because we are part of the research project. So, you know, if it's the global north, we are the authors. This is global south, this is collective. So I think we have here a double sword in a way, because in order to get funding, we need to get into some kind of agreements, but how the ethical use of the money and how the ethical or more democratical, let's say, organization of power within these groups is really complicated, just to say the least.
Well, thank you ever so much. I think we give the speakers a chance to reply, because clustering more questions will lead to confusion. So who would like to start? Maybe I ask first in the room and then in the Zoom chat.
Well, I can start. Well, thank you for the questions. And this is a ethnographic study on Europe. So I'm talking about the local situation, right? It's an ethnography of European academia. The Indian scholars are part of this academia. So my fieldwork is Europe, let's say, like this. So my starting point was precarity as this pervasive phenomenon. So I started by bringing some numbers and saying that academic precarity is pervasive in Europe. And what I'm saying is that there is the manner how precarity affects locals and, for example, Indian scholars is not the same. This is what I'm saying. There is a history, there is a present specific to how circulations happen and are funded also. So in this sense, I'm not suggesting that the border should be shut down. I'm saying that you should have a critical look at how these circulations happen, are funded. So, for example, this is related to Eloisa's question on funding. Is funding always nation-based, and what we do with this funding? In this case, funding is not always nation-based. Sometimes it's diaspora-based, for example. It's not the country. Sometimes it's there are Indian companies. Gajendran was talking about that yesterday. Sometimes there are companies that fund research centers in the UK, for example. Sometimes there are billionaires and they come with a lot of money. They put their own name in a chair because they gave the money. And that chair will be occupied by high caste students only. And this is something that Gajendra was saying yesterday, for example. So we should have a critical look at that, because is this the kind of diversity we want for science? A kind of diversity that reproduces inequality, you say only caste-based inequality, for example. So this is a question. So I think that what I'm showing is that there are specificities to it, to different kinds of circulation, and exactly what we do with this money and this funding that funds these circulations, for example.
Thank you very much.
Should I?
Yes, go ahead.
I find it difficult to give a general response because I think funding is an extremely complex issue. So Eloisa, when you speak about the relational, interpersonal aspect of it, yes, there is that, and the criticisms you're voicing are very much valid. We have very many examples of those things happening, but I think we also need to look more closely into how it all works. We have somebody gives funding to an institution, you have a bureaucracy that deals with it, with its own norms, its own laws and regulations attached to it. And then you have the people who receive the funding and to do something out of it. So each step in the process is to be analyzed. And I don't think there's any generally valid argument. You have many funding agencies that impose an agenda, and it's clear that nothing interesting will come out of it. You have, I mean, Barbara spoke about the experiences with the BMBF funding the other day, informally. I don't know if you want to repeat it officially, but you would need to do the ethnographies of those processes over a time span of 4 or 5 or 10 years. You have examples like the South African labor studies field that I looked at that received enormous funding from abroad. And it was interesting because it did not at all lead to any sort of intellectual dependency attached to that. It was funding that came out of the anti-apartheid solidarity. South African white English language universities were functioning as money laundering institutions to get that money into the Black labor movement. There were no strings attached. It was complete trust in people to spend that money on meaningful things. The money was there, and professors would walk out of their office with suitcases full of money to do something out of it. So it's complex. It's not so easy. So I think we need more systematic research to make some more general claims about that, which for now I don't have myself.
Well, thank you very much. Now we have Professor Arif replying online, and then next is Professor Alatas with this question. So Professor Arif.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to address some of the questions. These are very complex, and as Vinicius and Dr. Keim have already said, I'd just like to talk about one thing very practical that is going on in India, because I think there's been a conversation of India right now. You probably would have heard of all the history of Indian money going to institutions abroad, particularly the UK. Again, that colonized kind of relationship in funding practices as well. But the problem currently we are facing, for instance, in India, is that institutions like the one that I'm working in currently, we do not have foreign funding clearance. And this is a political decision which has been made, which means that as an institution, you cannot receive foreign funding. That political decision is really about a kind of way in which certain types of research agendas are being, shall we say, strangulated. And this is where I'm suggesting that a certain kind of global financing, sort of academic financing networks need to be very potent in countries like India. But having said that, and this is where, so that political problem is something that we're currently facing, very difficult to know where it will all go. Are we going to get funding, and in what areas, particularly in the social sciences? Hard sciences might still have a hope. Social sciences, very difficult. So now we get to the second problem that Eloisa is raising, and that's a very important point. And this is what I was trying to indicate, that we need to understand what kind of extractive practices are going on. Plagiarism, etc., is one thing, becoming, as you said, becoming exalted clerks sometimes, and extremely humiliating situations where we have students who work, or sometimes faculty, who work as research assistants to visiting professors. No citations, no acknowledgement, nothing. And most importantly, and this is something that I worked on for years, is that it is very clear, the division of labor. You give us the data, we theorize. You will not contribute to anything theoretical and conceptual. And I can go on all day about that. So this is a huge problem. So this is something that I'm with you on, Eloisa, on this. We need to address this. And this has been written theoretically, rhetorically, all of us have been writing about this. But there is something in funding that can be used to address this question. The second point, and I hear Professor Alatas on this as well, that while I am talking about not institutionalizing diversity, perhaps regional or area studies is a part of that, because we do know where area studies came from, especially in North American academia. What I'm suggesting again is something that I'll just very briefly mention. One thing is, of course, that what area studies and regional studies do is the reverse flow is not possible. That as Indians, you're expected, and this is a history, long history, even until today, you will find very few students going to America from India, and I suspect from anywhere else in the global south, who's allowed to, with funding, go anywhere else for research. They will have to come back to their own home nations, to their own regions, etc. There are many reasons for that, etc. But I hear you on this, which is very, very important, which is that the regional area expertises that we have need to be revisited. And in that, the funding process, which is extremely important, is that somehow we need to ensure that this funding comes in to support institutions in local countries for not just local issues, but issues around the world. Some equity, some hope of equity at least, may perhaps be established if we strengthen local. One of the things, for example, I'm trying now, and Claudio knows about this, that I'm trying my best in my university to think if we can build up a regional hub. So in theory, I'm not against the area studies program. I'm very much for it, but it needs to be recalibrated. And to say that we need our own students, We need to have people from outside going outside, but we certainly need our own students also going out to other places in the region, build up that local strength, not just in constant opposition to the North, to some imagination of Eurocentric hegemony in theory, etc. All that is wonderful and great. We've been doing it forever, but we need something more now. We need some parity. We have excellent students, but nobody has the confidence, because as Vinicius knows this very well, anybody with a Stanford degree and a Princeton degree, and there are thousands of Indians with Stanford and Princeton PhDs, will be chosen for a job. In India, we have universities where foreign degrees are given more salaries than local students. These are things that we need to look at, and these are at various levels. You see, this is not just a North-South relationship. There are many, many. Anyway, I don't want to take too much time, but as you can see, I can talk about this for the rest of the day. But anyway, thank you so much. Thank you for the questions.
Well, thank you very much also for the very engaged question, which prepares all the way for the next panel. Now we have Professor Hebe Vessuri, please. It's your turn.
Well, okay. Well, I sympathize very, very much with what Jasmine has been telling us, because this is such a long story of contact and of being positioned in particular places. You may want it or not, but then if you come from such a place, then you're stuck there. That really, it would be very, very healthy if funding really started to change quite a bit in its approach, and in the possibility of trying to have a more leveled ground for interaction, for competition, for dialogue between people in different places. I also like what she mentioned before about the anthropology without borders. This was a very, very old aspiration, perhaps. Being both anthropologies, we can share that. But this is an important fact. It's not just to produce a unique world. Perhaps ultimately we get there, but it's the possibility of you being able to choose whatever you want and explore as being a human being and sharing with other human beings in different cultural situations, but that you can really do and say what you have to do and say. No? And linking that to area studies, look, Claudia, we have this the historical experience of Claxo as a regional hub and networking and area study and so on has been very successful, and it comes before the area studies in the US and even in Europe. It was a project from UNESCO that really took root. We may have criticisms at the insufficiency of Claxo and so on, but really it has created a space, and it's a space of research, of interaction, of communication. We're looking at the problems of book publishing today, and Claxo has managed to have this huge library of open access books with research on Latin America, with topics that are of concern, and there is a tradition in the region, and that everybody can share it, and can share it for free, which is very important in a region that where because of political reasons, foreign currencies is always so difficult. But then you can think of area studies in a different way, in which it turned out to be sort of enclosed, encapsulated in certain countries, which you have the label, well, you belong to that area, and so you are done. You have to stick in there. And Claxo precisely has ensured the possibility of having links with Africa, with Asia, with the rest of the world. And we can go then having this constant movement. Okay, we have, well, our feet and our shoes are in a particular location, but we can think of the planet Earth that becomes every day smaller and smaller and smaller. No? So that is, I think, is an important element I wanted to mention in connection with funding and looking at different things. I was always very worried that in Europe, even in the European Commission, when you had the programs, funding programs for meetings, for projects, whatever, with third parties, it was ultimately for showing, I mean, using the other for your own purposes. It was not, let's have the money and do have a meeting somewhere else in order to learn from that reality and to help those people to show us what they are and what they want. No, it just, well, is this useful to France or to Germany or to whoever, Britain? And then you have the rest of the world continues to come to Europe, but you don't put the money for other initiatives that can be developed independently with the concerns, the questions, the interests of other people that are outside. That I think would be the real internationalization of our research scope and funding. No? So we still have to get there, but eventually we'll get there. And something that you also mentioned, Jasmine, that really, it really rings the bells to me, which is very important because I'm very, very worried, which is with this sick nationalism that we have, it's growing nowadays, and we don't need that. It's not the old cosmopolitanism as against the traditional nationalism. No. It's a very diseased nationalism that doesn't have anything to do with the contemporary world, but it's growing, and it's growing because there are very dark interests around it. We have to struggle against that. And I think that we have a long way to go there, but that has to be looked also in terms of funding, and because it's not that we have to really end up supporting that kind of exercise, no. But I don't know. Some ideas. What I've heard here is very exciting, and I would like to keep in contact with all of you. Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Alatas. Thanks for your patience. I hope you haven't forgotten the question meanwhile, so please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. No, I haven't forgotten because I've written them down. But just to remark before that, that I'm so much in agreement with Professor Vessuri's last point about the sick nationalism that is taking over. And with all our preoccupation with Eurocentrism and decolonization, during that time, our universities, at least in some countries, are being taken over by the nationalists, while joining us in the denouncing of Eurocentrism. But they have a completely different agenda, and their understanding of decolonization is different from our understanding. So I guess that's something that we need to think about as well. So I just have three questions. The first one is a short question for Wiebke. You noted the massive funding for the Islamization of Knowledge project, despite the, or rather the mediocre outcome despite the massive funding. So my question is, what do you mean by the mediocre outcome, and why do you think there was this mediocre outcome despite the massive funding? The second question is actually directed to practically everyone, but to Yasmin, to Vinicius, to Hebe, and to Wiebke. All of you are in one way or another talking about something that has to do with the economy, with economics, or the political economy of knowledge production. Now, there are at least there are 3 or 4 theoretical perspectives that deal with this. But the two that I feel are very relevant to what you are saying, although you don't mention it, is academic dependency, the theory of academic dependency, and the more recent discussion on academic capitalism, which is, I guess it overlaps with academic dependency, but it means something different. It really refers to this problem of balancing the trade-off between the purely scientific concerns that we all have as scholars on the one hand, and the issue of the economic maximization of profits, which are the concern of university administrators and ministries of education. So my question to all of you is, how do you, I mean, when we look at the political economy of knowledge production, it's so complicated. Can we not say that thinking in terms of these theoretical perspectives can help us to, to maybe more systematically understand the different types of problems relating to political economy of knowledge production? Why am I saying that? Just to give an example, the issue of academic dependency is quite a different issue. It has to do with dependence on, the knowledge powers in, in North America and the UK and so on. Whereas academic capitalism is from the problem of academic dependency within our own universities in the South. There are these problems of, this thinking of our students as clients or customers, and closing down courses because they're not economically viable and so on. So different kinds of political economic problems. Yeah. So that's my question to all of you. My last question, I'm sorry to be so long. This is for Asra. And Asra, I'm very interested in your work because I myself have been working on Hadrami Arab migration in the Indian Ocean, but specifically to Southeast Asia. I have so many issues, but I don't have time to discuss all of them. But I was struck by what you said, that Indian Ocean world is underrepresented in favor of the Atlantic world. But I would like to point out that for many years, since the 80s, maybe more than 1990s, there have been studies on the Indian Ocean world, specifically on the spread of Islam, with a focus, of course, on Hadrami Arab migration to East Africa, to Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, but most importantly, Kerala, and then, of course, to Southeast Asia, to the Malay world. And within that context, Philip Curtin, who wrote in the 60s and 70s, had this notion of a trade diaspora, which is a very interesting perspective as to how to explain the spread of Islam through trade, through a network of kin-related groups, let's say from the Hadramaut, who settled in Zanzibar, the same families settled in Surat, in Calicut, in Jakarta, and so on. So I think these are sort of issues that you might want to take into account. Last point, you mentioned Chisti orders, very important, but the Chisti orders came via land to India, not via sea. It is mainly, I think, from the sea. It's the Hadrami Ba'alawi Sufi orders that came to India. I thought these are some of the issues that you might think about. But please explain what you mean by the ocean world, the Indian Ocean world being underrepresented. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Alatas. I think we really have to make a quick round of answers now. Who would like to start?
I can start very quickly. I think I just wanted to first acknowledge my appreciation, everybody, Professor Vessuri, Professor Alatas, for hearing what I had to say very clearly. The one point that I'd like to make is with an example, which is this question of how do we manage these funding issues, as you're saying, academic dependency, academic capitalism. And I can give you just a very personal, small, short example. I've recently moved, and it addresses all the questions that I've recently moved from this enormous edifice called University of Delhi to a private institution. Strangely enough, given the kind of nationalist tendencies we have, the private spaces, with all its managerial nonsense, is effectively the only spaces where some of us can even open our mouths, not necessarily in ways that are going to trouble management. We don't want attention on us. None of us are going to use bad words, but we are still going to find a place where we can participate in some conferences, invite some people, things which are slowly beginning to disappear. So once again, the recalibration of what capitalist funding and our spaces of academic discussion, it needs some more rethinking. And I'm certainly trying to grapple with all of this, not to make quick and easy assumptions, but nonetheless, these are problems out there that we have to think through. And as we have all said, we have to worry a lot about how nationalist tendencies are recalibrating with decolonizing anti-colonial tendencies. So these are very important things. The rest I'm going to ask others to respond. Don't want to take up much time, but thank you everyone. Hope to be in touch with everyone later as well.
Possible?
Okay, I'll try a quick answer. Thank you, Farid, for giving me the opportunity to speak a bit more about that. I had to be very brief because it was not a presentation on the Islamization of knowledge debate as such. What I meant is when I started to be interested in that debate, it was the same impetus that made me read the debate on indigenization of knowledge or on the Latin American dependency theory. So there was an interest in, is there anything any alternative to mainstream sociology coming out of there? So my interest was on the social sciences and more particularly on sociology. And there I see that massive institutional construction set up with all its opportunities for publications and encounters and so on. But I honestly think that for the field of sociology, it's not particularly interesting. I think there's people in those Islamic universities and research institutes who do all sorts of interesting stuff, but not sociological. So I assume in jurisprudence, in theology, it's interesting. But I think in sociology, something similar happened to what you described for Islamic economics. So either it is, as a secular researcher, I would say, either it is dogma or it is mainstream sociology with some decorative additions, some quotes from the Quran and so on. And the books I have been provided that people were proud of, here's our last collective achievement, an edited book on whatever it was, effeminate students at International Islamic University of Malaysia, and it was not good. The quality of the research was not good. So other people are doing interesting stuff, but they could do it without the label of Islamization of knowledge in sociology. They could do, call it whatever, intellectual history or all sorts of things, but they wouldn't need the label to do it. That was my point. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that nationalism is an important issue here. It's part of my, it concerns part of my talk. There is the transnational construction of Indian nationalism. So it's less about internationalization and more how universities at their heart work hand in hand in the construction of certain kinds of nationalism that are transnationally built. So, for example, when I gave the example of billionaires and diasporas. So there is my interlocutors in general. They were progressive people, left-oriented, etc. And they always said, "I'm not part of any diaspora." So these Indian scholars, the diaspora is associated with chauvinistic, nationalist ideas. Okay, and they say it very clearly. I'm not part of any diaspora, because the diaspora is associated in the UK, especially with these upper middle classes and castes that are funding nationalist projects, either in the UK and in India. So when a billionaire, he gives a lot of money, it happens much more in the US, actually. He chooses the name of the center, but it happens in the UK too. So recently, to give an example, in Oxford, there was this Indira Gandhi Center, okay, for development, something like this. And during the Modi government, the name of the center was changed. So under the influence of the Indian government. And so in a certain extent, this transnational nationalism is building what is being taught and who is being hired in other countries too. It happens. It's not conspiracy theory. It happens. So even the idea of academic dependency is very, I mean, it has to be relativized here, because in some extent, India is defining what is taught in the UK, for example, in the US, the kind of publication that is being funded, it happens too. And I don't want to end on a bad note, or just a negative note. So good things happen too. And it's not just to be nice, but I think that the question here is, we have to look at this, how money circulates, what it funds, who it is being funding, what kind of projects, intellectual and political projects being funded. So I had the chance to stay at the SEMIs. Gajendrani is here. He is based at the SEMIs in Göttingen. I think it's a very good example of good experiences of funding circulations of people with a big array of trajectories, social backgrounds, family backgrounds. It's there is something happening there, I think. Which is different from other experiences I'm criticizing. So I think it's really about how we are talking about inequality, right, in science. How we can address inequality in a very complex way. So, which is not, for example, it doesn't oversee caste-based circulations, for example, which is
Okay, so thank you very much. And we now have one last question from the podium. One last quick question.
All right, so thank you all panelists. And we've been talking about the geographies of knowledge production and how this speaks to forms of inequality. I was just wondering whether you have some advice, particularly one area we've not been focusing on is sustainability in terms of the North-South interactions and the politics of scientific production. So my question is, for this kind of interaction between North and South to be sustainable, must funding and funders remain solely in the North? So I put it a bit more sarcastically. Where are the billionaires in India and in Africa and in Latin America? Where are they? Or is it that they get their priorities totally wrong in terms of science and knowledge production? Perhaps it is high time for us as scholars maybe to generate research proposals to ask the question. Maybe we can reformulate a research question that says, why is funding and funders not emanating from the South in a way that kind of creates a new dynamic of sustainability? This is just a question, and anyone could respond. Otherwise, I think there's a very crucial form of inequality that would continue to be perpetuated.
Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid we don't have much time left. Actually, we're running over time, but a very brief answer to that, or shall we leave it as a common and an open question?
Thank you. I'm fine.
Very quick answer is possible. A very quick answer that
Very quick, very quick.
There are billionaires and there are billionaires. As Vinicius told you, many Indian billionaires are funding very nationalist agendas with lots of money in diasporic situations, money going from India to various countries abroad. And locally in India, some private universities are being set up by billionaires. So this takes a little bit of doing in terms of unpacking where money is coming from. And you're absolutely right. We need our local billionaires to figure out what is right and wrong, but they've got their priorities. They've worked it out, some of them at least. So that's a very quick answer, but a larger question certainly needs to be thought of. Thank you, though. It's an important question.
Well, thank you so much for this really engaged panel. So I think we could really go on. So thank you so much for this to the speakers on site and online, and also for the debate in this room. So we will now rush to the coffee break and then come back to continue with the next panel.
Yeah, just not to let the blood to get cold, as we say in Portuguese. In 5 minutes, we rejoin, and we'd like to start with the provocation left by Afe on this. I can provide some personal, say, ethnographic endeavors I've been doing with this kind of people.
I can call some billionaires I have on WhatsApp.
Okay, good.
And to join us later.
Okay, wonderful. Guys,
Okay.
5 minutes. We have also some other guests from funding bodies, which are joining us for the discussion. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, guys. Ciao, Hebe. Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Wow. I don't know where I left.